The mockery. The grand ballroom of the Silver Crown Hotel was glowing with golden light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, spreading a soft shine over the guests. It was the annual Hale Charity Gala, an event where the city's richest people gathered to drink, laugh, and show off. Victor Hale, the billionaire host, stood near the piano at the front, a glass of wine in his hand, his smile sharp and confident. He loved being the center of attention, loved the way people tried to impress him. The sound of gentle piano music floated through the air as a young professional pianist played in the corner. The guests clapped politely when the song ended, and Victor gave a small nod. "Not bad," he said in a voice that was loud enough for everyone to hear, but nothing unforgettable. Some people chuckled, eager to agree with the man who owned half the city. At the side of the room, Maya, the black janitor, was quietly sweeping near the wall. She wore a plain uniform, her dark hair tied back, her head bowed as if she didn't belong in the same space as these people. Her broom moved slowly over the polished floor, collecting invisible dust that didn't matter to anyone but her. She had been working there for 3 years, and most guests never even noticed her face. Victor's eyes wandered over the crowd, looking for the next bit of entertainment. Then, perhaps out of boredom or arrogance, his gaze landed on Maya. He smirked and called out, "Hey, you!" The guests turned to look at her. Maya froze for a moment, unsure if he was speaking to her. "Yes, you with the broom," Victor said, waving his hand toward the old upright piano being rolled in by the staff. "Do you play?" The room went quiet except for a few low laughs. Maya's eyes moved from Victor to the piano and back again. "I haven't played in a long time," she said softly. Victor grinned, sensing an opportunity to show off his wit. "How about this?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If you can play something impressive, I'll marry you right here." Laughter burst out across the room. Some guests covered their mouths, others openly clapped at the joke. The idea of a billionaire marrying a janitor was unthinkable to them. Maya lowered her gaze, but there was no sign of embarrassment in her eyes, only something unreadable. Victor leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting her to walk away. But instead, Maya put down her broom and walked toward the piano. The laughter faded into a curious silence. It was the first time many of the guests had really looked at her. She sat on the worn piano bench, her hands resting on her lap, her fingers flexed slightly as if remembering a feeling long lost. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "Go ahead," he said. "Show us what you've got." Maya took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. When her fingers touched the keys, the first note rang out. Clear, sharp, and pure. It cut through the air like a drop of water in still silence. Several heads turned instantly. The second note followed, then the third, forming a slow, haunting melody. It was not the clumsy sound of someone playing for fun. It was the touch of someone who had lived and breathed music. The laughter stopped completely. Victor's smile faded just a little. The melody began to rise, each note stronger than the last. The chords were rich and full, weaving together into something powerful. Maya's body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her hands moving with effortless grace. Some guests looked at each other in disbelief. A man near the back whispered, "She's amazing." A woman nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. Victor leaned forward, his expression hard to read now. He had heard music like this before, years ago, from someone he could never forget. And that memo, Rye was beginning to itch at the back of his mind. The room seemed to shrink around her music. Every ear was locked on the sound, every eye on her moving fingers. The chandeliers swayed slightly from the soft vibration of the notes. Her playing carried something more than skill. It carried emotion. There was sadness, pride, and something unbroken hidden inside every sound. When the final note of the song hung in the air, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat. Then, applause erupted, not polite but real. Victor did not clap. Instead, he studied her with a strange look, part suspicion, part curiosity. Maya stood slowly, brushing her hands together. "That was unexpected," Victor said at last. Maya met his gaze calmly. "I told you," she said. "I haven't played in a long time." Suspense builds here. No one in the room knew it yet, but the night had just changed for everyone. The first notes. The applause still echoed faintly when Victor raised his hand, signaling the room to quiet. His eyes stayed locked on Maya, sharp and searching. "That was a warm-up, wasn't it?" he said slowly, as if he already knew the answer. Maya gave a small shrug. "It was enough," she replied, her tone calm but unreadable. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that something more was coming. Victor stepped closer to the piano, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. "If you're as good as you seem, then play something real," he challenged. "Play something that will make us remember tonight forever." His voice carried a mix of doubt and curiosity. Some guests whispered in excitement, eager for the next song. Others folded their arms, thinking it was all just a lucky trick. Maya sat back down without another word. Her hands hovered over the keys, not moving yet. It was as if she was listening to music only she could hear. The room grew still. Glasses paused mid-air. Waiters froze in place. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their light a little. Tighter, then she began. The first note was soft, almost fragile, like the beginning of a secret. It was followed by a cascade of quick, bright tones spilling into the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. The change in her style was immediate and shocking. Where the first song had been slow and haunting, this one was alive, fierce, and unstoppable. Her fingers danced over the keys faster than most eyes could follow. Every note struck the air with precision, each chord blooming into the next without hesitation. Gasps came from different corners of the room. A man in the front row dropped his wine glass, too caught up in the music to care. The rhythm built higher, her hands crossing and uncrossing in a blur. It wasn't just technical skill. There was a fire in her playing, a fire that spoke of something personal, something that burned far deeper than a simple challenge. Victor's smile faded entirely, replaced by a faint crease of recognition. Somewhere in a buried part of his memory, he had heard this piece before. It was a composition known only to a few in the world, and one of those few had been his father. He didn't like where his thoughts were leading him. The melody climbed to its peak, fierce and unyielding. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom, pressing against the walls. Guests were no longer whispering. They were holding their breath. When the final chord exploded into the air, the silence that followed was almost unreal. Then the applause came again, louder, raw, and without hesitation some guests stood to their feet, clapping hard, their eyes wide with awe. Victor did not move. Instead, he asked, almost in a whisper, "Where did you learn that?" Maya looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "From someone who played it better than I ever could," she said softly. The words made Victor's chest tighten, though he didn't know why yet. Before he could speak again, an older man near the back of the room leaned forward and narrowed his eyes at Maya. "I've seen you before," he said aloud, his voice carrying over the crowd. Victor glanced toward him, frowning. The man's gaze sharpened. "You're not just a janitor, you're—" But before he could finish, Maya stood and stepped away from the piano. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes that hinted at storms yet to come. She picked up her broom again, as if the music had never happened. But the room could not unhear what she had just given them, and Victor could not shake the feeling that tonight was only the beginning, a hidden past. Victor's gaze followed Maya as she moved toward the far wall, her broom once again in her hands, but no one in the room was looking at the floor anymore. All eyes stayed on her, as if she carried a secret that had just brushed against the surface. The older man who had spoken earlier leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Maya. Victor's curiosity was burning now, a mix of pride wounded by her skill and a strange pull he couldn't explain. He walked toward her slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. "Who taught you that piece, Vo?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Maya did not look at him. Instead, she kept sweeping as if his question did not matter. The guest nearby leaned in, desperate to hear her answer. Finally, she said, "Someone who knew music better than anyone alive." Victor's jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me," he said, trying to keep his tone light but failing. "That song. My father once told me only 3 people in the world could play it." Maya's broom stopped mid-sweep. She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "Then I suppose I make 4, she replied quietly. The remark hit him like a sudden chord in a silent room. It wasn't arrogance. Her voice held. Something else, something heavier. Victor opened his mouth to question her further, but the older man from earlier stood up. I know exactly who you are, the man said, stepping forward. You're the daughter of Samuel Cross. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Gasps broke out from the crowd. Samuel Cross, the prodigy pianist, the man whose performances had been spoken of like magic, he had vanished from the public eye years ago after a scandal ruined his career. Victor felt a sharp jolt in his chest, remembering how his father had spoken about Samuel with a strange mix of respect and bitterness. Maya's eyes darkened for a moment, but she did not deny it. The older man smiled faintly. I saw you play when you were a child in Paris, he said. You had the same hands, the same fire. A ripple of murmurs moved through the guests. Suddenly, the janitor sweeping the floors had become someone else entirely, someone who did not belong to the shadows. Victor took a step back, unsure whether to be impressed or unsettled. The memory of his father's late-night arguments about stolen music and ruined careers came rushing back. It couldn't be connected. Could it? He glanced at Maya again, but her face gave nothing away. You've been hiding, he said, trying to sound casual. She gave a small nod. Some talents are better kept hidden, until the right moment. The sentence made the air in the room feel heavier. Victor sensed there was a meaning behind her words that had nothing to do with music alone. He also sensed that whatever this moment was, it had just begun. The crowd was now buzzing. Some people whispered in awe, others speculated about why she was here. Victor's rival, seated near the bar, watched with a sly smile. Clearly enjoying the tension, Maya quietly set her broom against the wall. Then, without waiting for an invitation, she returned to the piano. Do you want to hear the rest of the story? She asked softly, her fingers hovering over the keys. No one answered because no one dared to breathe. Victor felt a strange unease settle in his chest. Something told him that the next thing she played might not just be music, it might be a message. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. The challenge. Victor's pride was a heavy weight pressing on his chest. The murmurs of the guests filled the ballroom like restless wind. Some looked at him as if waiting for him to reclaim his power. Others looked at Maya with admiration that made his jaw tighten. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. If you're really Samuel Cross's daughter, he said slowly, then you won't mind proving it. Maya raised one eyebrow, her fingers still resting gently above the piano keys. What proof do you need? She asked, her voice steady. Victor's lips curled into a challenge. There's a piece, he said, a piece so difficult that only my father and two others could play it without mistakes. The crowd's attention locked on the two of them. Maya's expression didn't change, though a faint spark lit in her eyes. Name it, she said. Victor leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only those near could hear. The Serpent's Waltz, he whispered. Gasps erupted instantly from those who knew the name. It was a notorious composition, fast, relentless, with sharp transitions that could break even the best pianist's rhythm. It had been written decades ago, and few had ever mastered it. Maya tilted her head slightly. Your father played it in public only once, she said. And even then, not perfectly. The remark hit him like a sudden strike. He tried to laugh it off, but there was no humor in his eyes. Play it, he ordered, stepping back. The guests leaned forward, drawn like moths to a flame. Maya placed both hands on the keys, closing her eyes for just a second. Then the first note sliced through the air. Quick and sharp, the tempo exploded instantly, her fingers moving in a blur that made the chandeliers tremble with each powerful chord. The melody twisted and turned with impossible precision. Her left hand struck deep, thunderous notes, while her right hand danced in lightning-fast patterns. It was as if two different pianists were playing at once, perfectly in sync. Gasps broke out, followed by whispers of disbelief. The rival businessman at the bar grinned wider, watching Victor's face grow pale. Victor's pride cracked with each flawless transition. He could hear no hesitation, no stumble, not even the smallest mistake. This wasn't just talent. This was mastery born from something deeper than practice. The piece demanded total control, yet she played as if the music itself belonged to her. By the time the final cascade of notes crashed into the room, the applause erupted like a storm. Some guests stood on their feet, cheering as if they had witnessed a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Maya lifted her hands from the keys and let them fall to her lap, breathing evenly. Victor couldn't bring himself to clap. Instead, he stepped forward and asked in a low voice, "Why here? Why tonight?" Maya looked up, her eyes steady. "Because," she said, "I'm not here to entertain you." The words froze him in place. The applause died down into a heavy silence. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying enough for the whole room to hear. "This isn't about you, Victor," she said. "It's about what your father did to mine." The guests murmured in shock. Victor's pulse quickened. He didn't like where this was going. Maya stood, the piano bench creaking softly, and for the first time that evening, her presence felt larger than the billionaire standing in front of her. The game had changed, and everyone in the room knew it. The truth, the air in the ballroom felt heavier. The glittering chandeliers seemed dimmer, their light struggling to break through the tension. Victor's confident smile was gone, replaced by a sharp, guarded look. Maya stood in the center of the room, the piano behind her, like a silent witness. "You want to know why I'm here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the guests lean in. Victor didn't answer, his jaw tight. She took a step forward, her eyes fixed on him. "Years ago, my father, Samuel Cross, was the brightest name in music," she began. "He wrote a masterpiece, a composition unlike anything the world had ever heard." Her voice softened, but her words cut through the air like glass. "The night before he was going to perform it, your father visited him," she continued. "Your father offered to buy the rights to that composition for a fraction of its worth." Maya's gaze swept across the room, landing on faces that were hanging on her every word. "My father refused," she said. "He believed music belonged to the world, not to one man's vault." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "So," Maya said, her voice growing colder, "your father used his influence to destroy him." She explained how Samuel's name was smeared in the press, how fake scandals were created to make him seem unstable, how every concert offer vanished overnight, how the masterpiece disappeared from Samuel's home, stolen under the cover of night, and how a year later that same piece appeared in Victor's father's personal collection. Gasps broke out in the crowd. Victor's rival at the bar tilted his head, his grin growing. Victor raised a hand. "That's not proof," he said sharply. But Maya reached into her small work bag and pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside was a stack of yellowed sheet music. "This," she said, holding it up so the closest guests could see, "is my father's original work. Every note in his own handwriting." She stepped forward, placing the folder on the piano. "And this," she added, tapping the first page, "is the same piece your father claimed as his own." The murmurs turned to angry whispers. Some guests glanced at Victor with thinly veiled disgust. Victor's voice rose. "You're accusing my father without—" Maya cut him off, her tone steady. "I'm not here to accuse," she said. "I'm here to finish what my father started." She looked toward the piano, her fingers brushing lightly against the keys. "He wanted the world to hear this as it was meant to be played," she said, "not locked away, not claimed by greed." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the chandeliers. Victor stared at her, his hands tightening into fists. "This is revenge, then?" he asked, his voice low. Maya shook her head. "No," she said. "This is justice." The crowd felt the shift in the air. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about truth breaking through years of silence. Maya turned to the guests, her voice steady. "Tonight, I will play this piece the way my father wrote it," she said. "And when it's over, you can decide for yourselves who it belongs to." She sat at the piano again. The worn sheet music opened before her. Victor stood frozen, trapped between anger, shame, and something else he didn't dare name. The first note was about to change everything, and the room knew it. The turning point. Maya's fingers rested on the piano keys. The worn sheet music lay open in front of her, its edges curled with age. The guests leaned forward, holding their breath. Even the waiters had stopped moving, trays frozen in midair. Then, with a soft press of her fingers, the first note rang out. It was slow, tender, carrying a kind of sadness that reached straight into the heart. The melody unfolded like a story, each chord speaking a truth words could not hold. Her father's spirit was in every sound. The room seemed to dissolve into the music. Time itself felt slower, as if the world outside had stopped. Victor stood still, unable to look away. The piece built layer upon layer, growing in strength and beauty. Her right hand danced over the higher keys, light as wind. Her left hand struck deep, steady chords that grounded the song. The guests began to realize they weren't just hearing music. They were witnessing something rare. A daughter finishing the work of a father wronged. As the melody soared, Victor's eyes darkened. Memories of his own father's ruthless deals flashed in his mind. For the first time, he felt a sting of shame, and with that shame came something he did not expect: regret. The piece reached its peak, fierce and unstoppable. The sound filled every inch of the ballroom, pressing against the walls. Guests had tears in their eyes. Some clasped their hands as if in prayer. The final notes came like a soft goodbye. They lingered in the air, trembling before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause came, not loud at first, but deep and sincere. It swelled into a wave of clapping, cheers, and even a few sobs. But Maya did not stand to take a bow. Instead, she closed the sheet music and placed it gently into the leather folder. She turned to the crowd and said, "Now you've heard the truth." Her gaze shifted to Victor, steady and unblinking. "You can keep laughing at people you think are beneath you," she said softly. "Or you can start listening." Her words hit harder than any note she had played. Victor's throat tightened. In that moment, the weight of the room's judgment was heavier than his fortune. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Maya picked up her broom, her back straight, and began walking toward the door. Before she could leave, the rival businessman stepped forward. "I'd like to offer you something," he said, his voice warm. "A stage, a recording, and the chance for the world to hear you." The crowd broke into approving. "Gee," murmurs. Maya gave him a small nod, but her eyes stayed on Victor for a heartbeat longer. Then she walked out, the sound of her footsteps fading into the hallway. Victor stood frozen, the piano still hummed faintly in the air, as if remembering her touch, and he knew, no matter how much he tried, he would never forget that melody, or the woman who played it.